welcome. We have two great speakers here with us today, and I'll just introduce them. You can read along in your programs as well. Ian Hussey began his work as a research manager at the University of Alberta's Parkland Institute in 2014, and he earned a career appointment in 2019. He's a steering committee member of the Corporate Mapping Project, a 7-year initiative supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and focused on the oil, gas, and coal industries in Western Canada. Ian is the author of Job Creation or Job Loss: Big Companies Use Tax Cut to Automate Away Jobs in the Oil Sands, and The Future of Alberta's Oil Sands Industry: More Production, Less Capital, Fewer Jobs, both for the Parkland Institute. And Ian is the co-author with Emma Jackson, who we just heard, of Alberta's Coal Phase-Out: A Just Transition, also for Parkland Institute. Ana Guerra Marin, she's a Communities Director and Just Transition Lead at Iron and Earth. She started her career in Colombia, listening to and empowering oil, gas, and mining workers at various work sites through forming partnerships and understanding worker issues. As Ana delved into the extractive industries, she became more aware of how important it is to address the environmental and socioeconomic impacts she was witnessing, and how urgent it is to create long-lasting solutions rooted in community-based initiatives that focus on the most vulnerable persons. This started a 15-year career focused on helping communities achieve self-determination through social and environmental justice in Latin America and Canada. As a white, cisgender immigrant woman with invisible disabilities, Ana recognizes her position in the world and challenges societal ideas by creating transformative change through a praxis informed by intersectionality and Black feminism, womanism, critical race theory, Indigenous peoples knowledge, decolonization, and critical consciousness. So we're going to have Ian speak first.
So my name is Ian. I work at the Parkland Institute. I mostly work on things to do with fossil fuels or climate policy, but I also write on minimum wage. For the last number of years, I've done work on the largest oil companies in Alberta, and that's what I'm going to start talking about today. We just published a report by the same name, Job Creation or Job Loss: Big Companies Use Tax Cuts to Automate Away Jobs in the Oil Industry. So I'm going to talk a bit about the corporate tax giveaway. Then I'll talk a bit about automation, and I'm going to end my presentation talking about the Alberta Federation of Labour recently published a report on creating new jobs in the energy industry as Alberta and Canada and the world progress in the energy transition. So I'm going to talk about the AFL's job creation strategy for the energy industry at the end. I'm sure everyone's aware the United Conservative Party gave a lot of money to large profitable corporations. What you might not be aware, because our 2019 election was a lot of bluster about the carbon tax and, the federal government sucks and that sort of angry populist rhetoric. But in fact, the corporate tax giveaway, the corporate tax cut, was the top priority of the United Conservative Party in their platform and in their election campaign in 2019. And they phrased it as the backbone of their, quote, job creation plan. So they sold this as a way to create jobs and boost the economy. What you may be aware of now is that's not actually what happened. One of the things we did in our report is my buddy Tony Clark did a couple Freedom of Information requests to the government of Alberta that he shared with me. And those were to do with the corporate tax cut. And one of the pieces of information that we got from Tony's Freedom of Information request was a briefing document that economists in the Alberta Treasury Branch and Finance in the government of Alberta did in advance of the UCP taking power. So it's a common thing in an election period, staff at the government, in this case a bunch of economists, they did research thinking that, okay, the UCP, they're leading in the polls, they may become the next government, therefore they will be our bosses as civil servants. We're going to do research on their policy platform, including a corporate tax cut. The advice that the Alberta Treasury Branch gave to the incoming government when the UCP formed government was actually their claims in their platform were not based in historical fact. They were not really based in economic theory, and it probably wasn't going to work out the way that they claimed in their election platform. The UCP ignored that advice. They not only instituted the corporate tax cut, they actually sped it up by more than twice as fast. They used the COVID pandemic as an excuse to accelerate giving billions of dollars to the largest corporations in our province. This, of course, that costs us a lot of money. And part of the point that we make in our report is that money could have actually gone to public services. So I'll talk about that a bit more later in my presentation. One of the things I've been doing for Parkland for a number of years now is I've been researching the largest oil companies in Alberta. They also happen to be the largest industrial corporations in our province. This led me to coin the term the Big Five oil sands companies. Those are Suncor, CNRL, Cenovus, Imperial Oil, and Hussey Energy. You may be aware that Cenovus actually merged with Hussey about a year ago, and so now we're talking about the big four corporations. These four companies operate 86% of oil sands production in our province, and that is about 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. Some information about corporate taxes or not. In Alberta, that's a real question of whether we get corporate tax revenue or we don't. So these companies, in their annual reports, they spend a lot of time reading financial reports, which is a pretty nerdy thing to do, but I actually get a kick out of it. These companies actually say in their annual reports, these are not my own calculations, they state this explicitly, that as four companies, they calculate that they saved $4.5 billion over the 4-year UCP term from this tax cut. And you may have heard this before. This is not not the only one who's dug up this fact. You know, I believe probably the Alberta NDP has, the environmental movement has. But one of the things that I did in my report that is adding information to the world is that's only like really part of the story. Because the way that corporate taxes work is if a company loses money in any given year, they can take that loss and actually reduce their taxes going forward into the future, or they can actually use it to reduce their taxes they paid in previous years. So it isn't just about getting a tax handout. If they have a big loss, such as like when the oil prices crashed in 2014, or the COVID pandemic happens, it's actually beneficial for them to lose even more money in 2020 because they get an even larger loss on their books for 2020, and they can use that to reduce their taxes going forward or going back. If they had profitable years, the last couple of years of the NDP government, 2018 and 17, these companies actually made a lot of money. So they can reduce the taxes they had paid in those years. And so that's what I'm saying here. The Big Five all received a net income tax recovery. That means they actually got money from the income tax system. So they got more money back from the tax system than they paid in. That's called a net income tax recovery. So in 2019, as a group, these five companies got $2.6 billion owed to the tax system in excess of what they paid in. So they're making money off of taxes. In 2020, because of the large losses to do with the pandemic, they actually received $6.6 billion in 1 year through the tax system. They start making money in 2021. The average price of West Texas Intermediate, which is the North American benchmark for oil, WTI, was trading at about $68 a barrel, which is a pretty good price. And these companies had net income taxes expenses of $5.2 billion. That means they paid $5.2 billion into the tax system in excess of what they might have recovered through the tax system. So over the first 3 years of the UCP government, these companies actually received $4 billion more than they paid in taxes. They literally didn't pay any taxes, and in fact made $4 billion off the tax system. As you can imagine, I don't think anyone in this room received that benefit through the tax system. We have this great communications coordinator at Parkland, Rita Braga, and she was able to take, with our designer, Flavio Rojas, able to take some of the research that I produced for my report. And so we produced some infographics for social media. This is one of them saying like, hey, these companies, they got a $4.3 billion tax giveaway. What did they do? After the tax giveaway, they cut almost 3,500 jobs. And they cut that mostly through automation and through the merger of Hussey and Synovus. This is a longer point of view from the 2014 global oil price crash. That's why we start, because 2014, when oil prices had been high from 2004 to 2014, there was a lot of construction in the oil industry, there's a lot of employment. So 2014 was actually the peak of employment in oil and gas in Canada and in Alberta. So that's why we start there. And as you can see, over the last 7 or 8 years, the Alberta industry has lost about 26,000 jobs. And in Canada, the national number is about 41,000. And you can see the jobs are not really coming back. And that's why we talk about automation, because the jobs are largely not coming back because these companies are accelerating automation. Automation in the oil and gas industry in Canada and Alberta specifically has actually been going on for about a decade, a little bit more than a decade, and it was increased. It was sped up in 2014. You have a global oil price crash. Companies ended up sacking in 2015 and 16 a lot of their staff, a lot of their technical, very experienced, very skilled workers. Many of those jobs didn't come back after these people were fired in 2015, 16. With COVID in 2020, these companies, particularly the leading 4 companies, used COVID as an excuse to accelerate automation even more, particularly remote technologies. And this could be anything from being able to pay attention to the details of their facilities using a lot of sensors that generate data, and then that data is then analyzed by advanced computing systems or artificial intelligence, as not necessarily like a human person looking at the data. Or, the more obvious example we kind of know about in Alberta is driverless haul trucks driven by robots, not by human drivers. So there's hundreds of truck drivers have lost their jobs. Companies do this, you might imagine, they're able to produce more oil or more gas, cut their costs, and they're able to therefore pay executives and shareholders more money. And the way that they're cutting their costs is they're cutting jobs, obviously, but they're also increasing the efficiency of their operations through advanced computing systems. And the big 4 oil companies are working with technology companies that you have heard of. AWS, Amazon Web Service, most of AWS's revenue is actually from technology. It's not from mailing you, books in the mail or whatever. And Microsoft. Microsoft has a long-term contract with Suncor Energy to increase digitalization of their company. This is just a quick shout out to the complete collapse of capital spending in the oil and gas industry by the major oil companies, these 4 companies. So you start in 2014 again. This was the peak of capital spending as well as jobs. These at the time, 5 companies were spending about $31 billion in 1 year on capital spending. That could be to build bitumen mines. It could be to build in situ production, which is a different type of production than mining. And then, real crash because of the price of oil in 15, 16. There's a bit of uptick in 17 and 18, and that's largely because CNRL and Suncor were building their final mines. Might be the last mines of the oil industry, and that work was completed at the end of 2018. And that's why, even in 2019, before COVID happened, you see a real drop in capital spending, because they're not spending billions of dollars building a bitumen mine. One thing I will mention that I don't think is in my slides is the Alberta Energy Regulator actually forecast forward through 2020, is the capital spending coming back? The answer is no. In the oil sands, the expectation is capital spending isn't going to be half of what it was, in the 2010s. And in crude oil and natural gas, we're looking at about 2/3 of the spending that we had experienced historically. And so the AER is not anticipating an influx of capital spending. So this is what I'm saying. They cut jobs, they automate away jobs, and the executives, the top paid executives of these 4 companies received a raise in 2021 on average of about $2.35 million. The average compensation of these 4 gentlemen is like $10 to $12 billion a year. Interesting fact, not on my slides, in 2020, 3 of these 4 executives received increased compensation in 2020. You think about how many people lost their jobs, the fact that we're all struggling to pay our bills. Well, 3 of the 4 of them received increased compensation because of the value of their stock. They own stock in their companies, and therefore, when that was paid to them on an annual basis, it had a certain value that was an increase in compensation for them. If you've been around Alberta for a while, you may have heard of the old campaign of the Alberta Could campaign. Hey, if the Alberta government had more money, it could do X, Y, Z. This is sort of the basis of this infographic, which is if Alberta had not given away $4.3 billion just to these four companies, and mind you, we're not talking about Shaw or TELUS or the pipeline companies, all of whom are billion-dollar companies as well. We're just talking about these four companies. If Alberta had kept that money, corporate tax revenue, we could have hired 10,000 employees in critical areas. I'm talking about nurses, teachers, educational assistants, people who work in long-term care facilities, any number of other roles, emergency medical responders. But we didn't have that money. And we know our healthcare system and our education system is critically underfunded. We know that we need more staff, and therefore we need the public revenue to pay for that, right? I want to end on this note. The Alberta Federation of Labor, which is the provincial body, the largest labor advocacy organization in Alberta, represents about 175,000 workers in the public and private sector. This could be healthcare workers. It could be workers that work in the energy industry. They recently published a really important study on the energy transition, how things are going, and how Alberta could actually lean into the energy transition and create, in fact, more jobs than we had historically in the energy industry. That's really important, and I wanted to share it with you today, and I'm happy to talk about this, because we need these propositional visions of like, what could Alberta be, where are Albertans going to work. You know, many people are very concerned, particularly people who work in the energy industry, about their future. I was recently at a conference and I spoke to Karen Capri, who's the Secretary Treasurer of the Alberta Federation of Labor. And she was saying, yeah, you know, hey, I know a lot of people that work in energy. They might have 10 years till retirement. They don't know, am I going to get those 10 years of employment till I can retire and, you know, have a good life with my family after I'm done being a worker. There's a lot of anxiety here. And so this is why it's so important the AFL has published this vision. And they're saying, you know, there's a lot of detail in the report, but I've sort of boiled it down to this one slide, that it is possible for us to create and sustain over 200,000 jobs in 2030 to 2050 with some important investments and some important rethinking about the energy industry and how do we diversify within the energy industry. And so I'll just run through this really quickly. I'm happy to talk about it further. I'm happy, you know, if you have a different vision of Alberta, happy to hear that too. The backbone of what they're saying is, listen, you know, right now, most of our oil and gas is being shipped to the States, and it's being shipped for combustion. It's used in power plants, it's used in vehicles, whatever. What they're saying is we can shift from producing fuel for combustion to producing feedstock for material production. And what that means is carbon fiber, asphalt binding, recyclable plastics, which is a petrochemical product, recyclable plastic, as well as the production of hydrogen. If it's blue hydrogen, it's produced from natural gas using carbon capture. Is going to require carbon capture utilization and storage. That's a complex topic. The important thing that the AFL is putting forward is, of course, the future of the energy industry and the future of our economy is electrification. That means that in Canada and Alberta, we actually need to produce 3 times the amount of electricity we're producing right now. And that's a really big deal. It's not going to be easy to do. It's going to require a bunch of money. It's going to require a bunch of skilled workers. But if we were to do that, it actually allows all kinds of other things to happen, which I don't have time to get into. Hydrogen is a hot topic. Right now, green hydrogen, which is clean fuel produced by renewable energy, it's costly. And it's costly because of a technology called an electrolyzer. Renewable energy, electrolyzer, green hydrogen. The electrolyzers are quite expensive. It's anticipated that the price for those are going to fall over the next decade. As well as organizations like the International Energy Agency are talking about hydrogen, they're talking about carbon capture. And right now it's possible, given that we produce a bunch of natural gas, that we could have carbon capture with natural gas. We could have blue hydrogen, which is still obviously based in fossil fuels, given it's based in natural gas. Sustainable aviation fuel is a new thing. There's a couple ways to produce this, but the most obvious one is you use like canola oil, biofuel, to mix with jet fuel. Suncor is already doing that. There's an indigenous group based in Treaty 7 around Calgary that has just proposed that they would like to produce biofuel to mix with jet fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, to sell that fuel to airlines flying out of the Calgary airport. So that's an indigenous business proposition. A big part of what the AFL is talking about is Alberta actually has a lot of potential for critical minerals and metals. This is like lithium and a bunch of other stuff that goes into electric vehicles and specifically batteries. And what the AFL is proposing is we shouldn't just like rip it and ship it kind of like we do with oil and gas. We should actually have a processing and manufacturing business in Alberta, like a midstream business where, yes, we would produce lithium and other critical minerals and metals, but we would actually process it here. We would have manufacturing jobs here. Of course, the AFL is proposing that those jobs be unionized, so workers have the benefit of unionization. And this would lead into us supplying batteries not only for energy storage, but also for electric vehicle charging stations or electric vehicles themselves. Obviously, a lot of those electric vehicles are going to be manufactured in Ontario. We don't have a lot of that manufacturing. And then they have a plan for net zero buildings, which again, I'm happy to speak about. So wanted to run through that quickly. It might have been too fast, but again, happy to have this discussion during the Q&A. So thank you.
Want to talk a little bit about what can I do? What can I do to do this anti-racist work? What can I do to do this putting indigenous peoples first into our processes? I want to talk to you about the work that I've been doing at Iron Earth, and it's based on that work. So my name is Ana Guerra Marin. I go by she, her. I'm originally from Colombia, and I am a guest in the lands of the Lekwungen and Swepson people, so-called Victoria, British Columbia. I would also like to acknowledge that I am currently in Treaty 6 territory in Métis Region 4. It's the home of many, many indigenous peoples. So I have a work experience and a lived experience that influenced the practice that I do. I was a geological engineer for 10 years in the extractive industries. I have a master's in human security and peace building, which is basically human rights and post-conflict resolution. And then after that, I spent the last 10 years working in social justice issues, specifically sexualized violence and immigrant rights. And I've been with Iron and Earth as the community's director and just transition lead for over a year. But I also have a lived experience, and my positionality helps me identify and see how I work in this world. As it was indicated, I'm white, cisgender, bi, migrant woman with invisible disabilities, and thanks to a lot of theory and great people, I have learned and unlearned a lot of things, and it's based in Black feminism, womanism, intersectionality, critical race theory, decolonization, etc. And because of my positionality, I've done a lot of self-advocacy and navigated a lot of different institutions that base the praxis that I work with and the way I see the world. And it's this conjunction of both lived and worked experience that influenced the community proposal and model that we're going to talk about today. So a little bit of Iron Earth. Iron Earth started when Ian was mentioning in the downfall of like 2014, 2015 in the oil and gas sector. And it was formed by fossil fuel industry workers at the time and focused to provide solution in the climate career as the jobs were disappearing in this industry. Since last year, our organization has gone through a big transformation that has led to expanding our vision and also diversified our board of directors and our staff. And with this in mind, what we do now is that we aim to empower fossil fuel industry workers, their communities, and indigenous peoples across nations and urban centers to play a leading role in building the infrastructure and the policy required to transition to a low-carbon economy. So now I'm going to talk about our approach. So our community approach is focused on developing relationships that go beyond a consultation model It meets folks where they're at, something that we heard a little bit on Emma's talk earlier, to understand their ideas on climate change, the transition, and income security, potential solutions, and their level of preparedness on any of those issues. Our approach is agency-centered and consent-based, which means that it's based on socially just models that aim to meet folks where they're at and build trust that is between us as Iron and Earth and the communities, and with care and emphasis on those most vulnerable. We center experiential knowledge as our learning sort of methodology, which recognizes lived experience as knowledge and expertise. We also work from a desire-based framework where we highlight and amplify what communities are already doing best and their responses to potential solutions. And we focus on collective processes in order to, in a way, to challenge the individualism that we experience in this land today. We have an Indigenous peoples approach. This community approach recognizes that Indigenous peoples across nations and urban centers are diverse and understands that we need to build long-lasting relationships built on trust that may not fit proposed timelines. Our approach discards the idea of presupposed plans that perpetuate paternalistic approaches and colonial behaviors and welcomes the stewardship of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. How does this community sessions look like? So our sessions are rooted in care and active listening, moving away from imposed narratives that can lead to disengagement and powerlessness. We want to generate ideas from the community, by the community, and with this, what it means is that we may replicate this approach across this land, but we center localities, geographies, and cultures and costumes when we develop the session and the script. We plan for a minimum of 3 sessions per community, with following sessions based on the findings on the previous ones, and the number accounts for potential differential outreach results, our Indigenous peoples approach, and to move beyond that idea of consultation. So what does that look like? The format of these conversations is really up to the people, as we recognize that each community has their own idiosyncrasies and has different styles and capacities. What works with that community may not work for the next. At this most basic, the conversations are about getting a group of people, ideally 35, so we can actually hear from everybody, to discuss and the questions that will be provided and record the answers. It's very simple. The standard format assumes a 2-hour session with an introduction, the breakout groups where we discuss the questions, and a closing event. So who facilitates? Since the session's goals is to be for the community, by the community, local residents are the key facilitators in these sessions. The sessions require 1 main facilitator and 2 for breakout session, and we try to provide all necessary support for those facilitators, community facilitators, including training, materials, and a contract position. And who attends? So we want to hear from everybody, but specifically from those who are often left out of mainstream narratives, those racialized, youth, elders, housing insecure, unemployed, different genders, migrants with diverse sexualities and diverse levels of ability. Those who face barriers to participation in political and public decision-making processes, those whose interests are often overlooked. At the same time, we want to hear from those at the front line of the climate change. We want to ensure that all potential barriers to participation are removed as possible. So we are offering competitive reimbursement, childcare and transportation stipends, a full meal, office supplies. We also recognize for different abilities in neurodivergency. So some people do not want to talk, they just can write, that's totally fine. And we also ask for individual accessibility needs that we also welcome as well. And what happens after? Still a work in process. So our goal is that by the end of the sessions, residents are the ones who are making decision of what kind of climate solutions they want in their community, an agency-centered approach. These relationships built and the information collected during the sessions will help tailoring the programming that Iron and Earth can do in the community, as well as potential partners. Our findings are also gathered in reports that highlight the residents' concerns and initiatives that the community wants to take and implement to do a more equitable energy transition. And these are shared with the participants, our key stakeholders that we do with our outreach, and policy makers and key decision makers as well. The report serves as the basis of continuing our work. So this is kind of like a trial and error process in which we keep refining the method, and also includes the scripts and everything we do so that it can be replicable and anybody can read it and share it. This has been tested under the Green Resilience Project in Hinton, Alberta, at our first session, which happened in January of this year. Our second session just happened in November, and it was now our first session as Iron on Earth outside of the Green Resilience Project. The results from the sessions actually affirmed our model of care, where participants were pleasantly surprised and welcoming the approach. The facilitator observations and feedback that we received was generated really positive experience, highlighting a communal, agreeable session. Participants felt engaged and comfortable and sharing their opinions, even though they might have been apprehensive at the beginning. The language used in these sessions was carefully crafted so that the audience could use terminology they could relate to and not feel pressured by imposed narratives. This resulted in participants organically bringing up several progressive ideas, such as basic income, and actually they were able to identify the polarization in media and the politicians that they see. So what we would see in the media, and here we've been talking about, the myths, the realities, the community in Hinton was able to say, yeah, we see that too. So that was very good. We share feedback forms at the end of the session that show high levels of satisfaction. Few participants were not familiar on the topics we discussed, but the majority, over 70%, of them learned something new about the topics. They all expressed interest. The 100% of all the feedback forms in both of the sessions expressed interest in continuing the conversation, and also expressed interest in being part of potential projects related to this. So we did a thematic analysis in Hinton for our first session, and what the people in Hinton are asking or saying is they want diversification. I don't know if you know a little bit, but in rural Alberta, diversification is the way people are talking about energy transition. So it's more about, let's not shut down oil and gas, let's just diversify our media. And they came up with that name. They said, we want diversification. The solutions need to be comprehensive and support both social and cultural, that was very important, aspect for economic transitions to be robust and inclusive. They want to be involved throughout the decision-making process and have transparency regarding directionality and decisions. And they need climate literacy. They ask for it. Clear and factual information in a positive manner that moves beyond polarization. Where we are at. This is an ongoing process for us, and will be occurring around the country, with Edmonton, yay, as our next community. We will be hosting a series of 3 sessions in 3 different wards here in Edmonton, and we will start with O'Dayman as our first stop at the beginning of the year, so in mid-January, hopefully. So if you live in O'Dayman, please, or if you're interested in knowing more about it, please feel free to reach out to me. I will share my contact information very quickly because we want to hear from you. We also be having our 3rd and final session in Hinton in the beginning of the year, and we'll be working on sessions in Saskatoon, Regina, and Saskatchewan, and 4 different communities in Newfoundland. This is my contact info. Thank you for your attention, and have a great day.
So my name is Omar, I'm from Fort McMurray. Thank you for this great presentation. This is a lived reality in my community. All the 4 big oil companies operate in my community, and people have noticed that even though oil prices are all-time highs, the jobs aren't really coming back the way they used to. And that's affecting the entire community, from housing prices to patronage at local businesses. All that is still fully affected. And my question is, how can we get that message out to decouple this notion that these oil companies have your best interests at heart when it comes to communities that really do rely on these oil companies for the majority of their economic output?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for being here to talk about this really important issue. You know, we tend to talk about the oil industry in very polarizing ways, and we're like getting big fights and stuff, and I don't really find that very helpful. As Ana put it, energy diversification, one of the things we need to talk about is we need to offer something else. Like, that's what you're asking, right? What is that something else? And I think that's why, you know, my last slide was the AFL's plan for what something else is. And I think that's been not entirely lacking. Some people are talking about it. We're not talking about it necessarily on a mass scale. And we tend to talk past one another. We use different language, and sometimes we say things that other people find very off-putting. The fact of the matter is, the energy industry writ large, whether that's oil and gas or, obviously Alberta is the fastest growing wind and solar province in Canada. There's going to be energy jobs. I think the question is with energy diversification, the oil and gas industry is, over time, there's going to be less demand for those products. And they're already automating away jobs. And even if there was increased demand, they're automating away jobs. So that's not getting us jobs. Part of the AFL's plan has to do with 4 impacts that people, workers, feel to do with the changing energy landscape. Some people are going to lose their jobs, like in coal. Coal was phased out in Alberta. Those jobs don't exist. That's one. Some people are going to have like job substitution where, in Ontario, you were producing gas vehicles. Now you're going to produce electric vehicles. We don't really have vehicle manufacturing here. There is also job transition where, in Fort McMurray and other parts of the province, people who worked in energy, a lot of them very skilled, very experienced, whether you're a pipe fitter, whether you are an electrician, those skills are still needed, right? And so there is a role for industry as well as government to work with workers to transition them to new jobs. So they still have a good income. Hopefully they have a union, so they have a pension and other healthcare benefits. One of the issues we're going to face, though, is with fossil fuel jobs. Obviously, a lot of them are Fort Mac, they're in Cold Lake. There's some natural gas production elsewhere or in, Northeast BC, whatever. With renewable energy, the jobs are more dispersed. So some people might have to move. One of the things that's very important about the AFL's plan is it's entirely possible for us to not only continue to have energy jobs, but to have more. It's just they might be different jobs or slightly different. In many cases, like I said, with a welder or electrician, whatever, you might need a slight tweak of skills. You might have slightly different work practices day to day, slightly different tools you're using, but generally you already kind of know what to do, right? And so that's the next phase of our conversation. And it's also being honest about the fact that the energy transition, the energy diversification, whatever you want to call it, is very complex. It's not going to happen overnight. And we need regional planning. That's why in Fort McMurray, I'll just do a little plug here. We don't know if we're going to get the grant, but we submitted a grant as a Parkland Institute to talk about regional economic development in Alberta, in Calgary, Edmonton, Fort McMurray, and Medicine Hat. And I can tell you, Fort McMurray's economic development plan is from like 2010. When I look at Calgary, Edmonton, and Medicine Hat is talking about energy diversification. They have a lot of natural gas production. The city owns a lot of that natural gas production. They're talking about that. They're elected officials, the admin staff that support elected officials in the city council, they are having that conversation publicly. I don't know if that's happening in Fort McMurray. That's one thing we would be willing to find out, obviously, if we get this grant. But that's a big part of it, right?
My name is Andrei, and my question is for Ian. So basically, what your talk was about is that UCP had a proposal what to do. There was strong evidence to believe that it will not work very well. They have proceeded anyway, and you have showed the implications. It did not work well. And on the one hand, it can show UCP as bad and evil and stupid, but I think that another problem here is that the system has allowed them to proceed with it despite the evidence that it's a bad idea. So what are your thoughts on how the system can be improved or fixed so that it's not possible to repeat it in the future?
Albertans, let's just be honest, we're quite angry and disillusioned during the 2019 election. The UCP were able to produce an effective frame that most of those problems were the fault of the federal government and the previous NDP government, and hey, we've got the solutions, we're going to fix all your problems. You know, a few years later, we obviously find we have more problems. In fact, they did not fix the problems. The simple thing is around corporate taxes, you know, beyond all the complications I talked about how companies can actually get money back through the tax system. A really simple line is like every other Western province, which the UCP like to compare us to, has a 12% tax rate. We have an 8% tax rate. Our 8% tax rate is not bringing us jobs. A lot of people, if they are employed, they're underemployed based on their skills and their experiences, or they just can't find full-time work, right? So that corporate tax giveaways, it's well known, there's decades of research on this, they don't create jobs. They create wealth for a few people. The other side of that is, you know, if I was in a political leadership of a party, you know, that's kind of what I was talking about with Alberta Could. If we had that revenue, what could we do? If we don't want to give it away to a bunch of wealthy executives, you know, we need a propositional vision of we propose to do X, Y, Z, right? And I think a lot of Albertans are concerned now that their kids don't have medicine they need, given the illnesses, the respiratory illnesses that are going around in Alberta and Canada. I think a lot of people, they go to, you know, the hospital, even the emergency room, and they can't get care because we don't have the staff. I think Albertans understand these things. I think we, to a certain extent, know the solutions because some of them are fairly obvious. We need more people working in those areas. What might be less obvious is, you know, kind of what we were just talking about is like the provincial government also has a role in supporting economic diversification, both within energy and outside of it, right? So that might be either the government directly investing in certain things that we need to do with energy diversification, or if they're go the route of, besides directly investing, like they might have equity in a company. They could invest in an industry or even a company, and we could have equity. That means we would partly own that company as the province of Alberta. Which is done in other provinces. And in fact, Jason Kenney's government did for a pipeline to America that didn't get built, right? They actually had an equity stake in that pipeline. So that's not crazy. The UCP even did it a couple years ago. You know, but the other part, an important role for government is also market steering, saying like, hey, you know, we know where things are going. We're not getting more oil and gas jobs, and yet there will continue to be a certain amount of oil and gas jobs. Well, what else is there? You know, we have a booming renewable energy industry, wind and solar. How can we support that as a provincial government? I would hope our government looks at those many solutions, and if they want to talk about it, you know, they know where to find me. But
last year, a friend of mine made $90,000 on a stock called pyrogenesis, and it's a plasma that's supposed to clean the ocean. And we all know that money is where everybody's at right now, anyways. Maybe not in the future. Have you heard of anything that is the same thing that's being developed for the atmosphere? Is it a possibility to have more green stocks that people can invest in to sort of start that movement, make a difference?
It's an important question for a number of reasons. The simple answer is we should not rely on technologies to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. That's a very dangerous road to go down. On a technological development level, like direct air capture, the technology is not there yet. And even with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, the technology has been demonstrated, but not proven at the scale that, you know, the big oil companies would like it to be. And so when they say like, oh yeah, you know, we're going to invest, we're going to totally reduce our greenhouse gases by a lot, and mostly doing that from carbon capture, that's a hope for them. That's not a guarantee that that's going to happen. Obviously, we can, a big part of Canada's environmental plan and around the world is we got to plant more trees. But the reality is most of climate change is caused by the burning of oil and gas. So we need to burn less oil and gas. And we have the ability to do that, right? We have the technology, the technological solutions. We know how to do it. We have a very skilled workforce in Alberta, you know, many of whom are unemployed. We have like the people, and we will need more than the people we have, but we have a lot of them already, right? As the question is, are we directing those people and some of that investment in the correct way, right? Into renewable energy, into a big part of like electrifying the economy is energy storage. And I sort of went over this really quickly in my presentation because I was speaking quite a long time. But again, we have the ability to do that. The International Energy Agency, the Alberta Federation of Labor, the biggest banks in Canada, they're all saying similar things around that. We need interties between provincial electricity grids. The way electricity works in Alberta is mostly, it's a provincial thing, and we don't have transmission lines into BC or Saskatchewan or whatever. We need those. BC has a lot of hydroelectricity, that's a clean energy, and we need that electricity, or some of it, to back up our booming wind and solar electricity. Because wind and solar is intermittent. The wind blows when it blows, and the sun shines when it shines, whatever. So that one way to have energy storage is actually through hydro dam reservoirs. Another one is just really big batteries. A third one is hydrogen. So I mentioned we have a hydrogen industry. We've had it for years. It's used in processing oil and gas in refineries. That is a thing called gray hydrogen, which is just made from natural gas, but it doesn't have carbon capture. And so I mentioned, in the future, when electrolysers in a few years are a bit more affordable, the technology is a bit more advanced, we can produce clean green hydrogen. And if you produce that when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, you can actually then store that hydrogen for use in the future for electricity when you need it in the future. So that's another form of energy storage. That's going to be really important. And we have competitive advantages in Alberta because of our great wind and solar resources. So we could do all these things, right? It's going to take a bunch of investment, and quite a bit of that's going to come from the private sector. And so government has a role in incentivizing that investment and steering the market in certain ways. But, like the AFL is saying, and I agree with this, there is a role for direct investment by our government, provincially and federally, even municipally, in directly investing in these things that I hope we all know now that we need.
What Ian is saying, and it's that relying to technology, for me is he mentioned, is a double-edged sword. So I wouldn't want to put that kind of bet in the future, especially on a place like the stock market, which is such a bet anyway. So for me, the best that someone can do now is at least make sure that their stock portfolio is not it's really not, it's ethical in a way. I'm not going to talk about greenwashing, but if you have stocks on RBC or all those kind of very simple stuff that you can do. I don't know if you noticed, but major corporations such as BHP, they actually divested from oil and gas completely in 2021. We'll see how that looks like. But they said, okay, our shareholders are saying that we don't want that. And so they moved away. Obviously, the production is not going to stop because it's being handled by an Australian company now. But it is, the shareholder do have power, and actually are the only ones who do have power, to change corporations into a more ethical consumption. So I would say, instead of relying on clean energies or new technologies to invest, it will be to actually, if you have acquisitive power, I don't know anything about that, but if you do have acquisitive power, to demand to your companies and stuff like that. And I think that what you see here, and the AFL showing it, it goes back to all of these questions. It says there's a push of innovation. We have to innovate, right? We have to do these things. There's already a lot of green economies right now that are in need of funding. So how about we focus on that? I mean, it's important to innovate. It's important to have the technologies. He mentioned there's a surplus. How about we pay better wages to the healthcare people, pay better wages to the educators? And I'm not trying to be facetious, because we do need innovation. And again, if you remember, I said I'm a geological engineer. I was there when carbon capture storage first came out in 2008. We were doing studies, but it's just, I see this and I'm like, technology is great, but as we see right now how Twitter's demise is happening, we can rely on it because there is no labor protections around it. There is no government accountability, auditability. So I'm very concerned about innovation. I love that, I'm hoping our future is green and stuff like that, but let's focus on what we have now. And if we have acquisitive power, and we share stocks is that our stocks are ethical.
I'm with the group called the Council of Canadians. We've been doing a series of symposia over here at TELUS, and the last one was on this just transition, which is kind of the focus here. So I'm quite interested in this, and having worked as an energy advisor myself with the EnerGuide program for quite a long time, that's one way to transition. I've also been involved with initiatives that, are efforts to get people to stop dreaming about this $200,000 job driving the upgrading machinery, because now they're being automated. Generally speaking, the comments, even by my MP last week, was that, people don't want to go to these lower paying jobs now. So I'm just wondering, would this be in this AFL report on projected incomes for these many exciting areas of employment? So that was my question for Ian. For Ana, I understand that these events you're putting on are only for former energy workers, right?
No,
so
it's for the community as a whole.
So just a reference, Ian, what are the projected incomes for these various exciting forms of occupation?
It's a bit of a red herring that people say, like, oh yeah, if you don't work in traditional energy like oil and gas, you're going to be on the breadline, man. You're not going to be making enough money. It's not really true. Just the average worker in wind and solar, they make $90,000 a year. That's a lot of money. Beyond that, an energy diversification plan, and we could talk about the AFL plan or any other one, is going to involve a lot of workers, like tens of thousands of workers of various jobs. You're still going to have truck drivers. Eventually those trucks might operate by battery or might operate by hydrogen, but someone's going to be driving them. Like we talk about electrifying the economy and the advancement of batteries and producing batteries in Alberta. Manufacturing jobs pay very well. Electrifying the economy and running transmission lines to BC, electricians need to do those jobs. Those are highly skilled workers, highly trained workers. These are workers, some of whom, there's a lot of electricians that work in the oil and gas industry. There's a lot that work in residential or whatever. They're already being paid well, and they would be paid well to run transmission lines to BC. I understand the framing that, you're going to make less money, but I think that is not based in actual reality or data. It's just, a talking point, usually by people who don't want energy diversification to happen, and it's a scare tactic. Yeah, that's just to say there's all kinds of a diversity of jobs that will be needed. And beyond that, the International Trade Union Confederation, sibling organizations to Parkland that do policy research. When we talk about energy transition or energy diversification, we tend to talk about that in a very siloed way where we're talking about energy workers, we're talking about electricians and welders and whatever. The reality is, in Fort McMurray, where this gentleman lives, in Cold Lake, a third of the population works directly in oil and gas. The hard truth is, when we lose an oil and gas job, we're actually losing 6 jobs. We're losing 4 indirect jobs, and we're losing 2 what are called induced jobs, which is like oil and gas workers spend money in the economy, and therefore people have to work in the economy to provide them with goods or services or whatever. If we lose a ton of jobs in Cold Lake or Fort McMurray, the entire regional economy is threatened. And that's why we need regional economic development plans. And it's not just oil and gas workers. It is people who work in restaurants. It's people who work in, cleaning, whatever, or healthcare workers, education workers. All of those people are part of us moving forward as a province into a different future. That's the conversation we need to have. It isn't about mass job loss. In fact, if we do this right, if we really think about it, we will have more jobs than we have now. And there's no reason why those can't be good jobs. There's no reason they can't be unionized. There's no reason, as part of energy planning, that we don't think about people that maybe don't have good jobs right now or maybe are unemployed. We don't think about the fact that often those workers are Black, Indigenous, people of color, otherwise marginalized, women, people with mobility issues, whatever, right? We can actually have economic planning that, thinks that everyone could have a decent job with decent pay, good working conditions. That's the ideal. That's what we hope for, right? But we're not going to get there unless we do it in a concerted way. We think about it and we really plan it out and we do it with purpose, right? And that's the conversation we need to be having.
I just want to touch base on the community approach and Iron Earth. What we did was expand our vision because of what Ian just mentioned. It's not just the workers, it's their families, it's the person at the Tim Hortons that will close down if the refinery shuts down. So it's kind of like a domino effect. And I want to talk a little bit about the future that AFL is looking for. And so yes, you can get $90,000 a year in a solar wind install, but those are unionized jobs. What the government and what companies want is a startup entrepreneurial model that we're seeing right now. So I've seen companies that come to Iron and Earth, solar and wind companies, like, we can't hire anybody. We can't get anybody. And I wonder why, and it's, oh, they pay $20 an hour, it's a contract job. And it's obviously they don't want unions. There is a future that we want, which is a unionized future with protected labor, with good jobs. But the reality right now is that we are not getting that. I always relate it to tech. Look at what happens right now in tech. Look what happens on Twitter, what happens on Facebook, what happens on Amazon. Those workers are being laid off by the thousands. This push for innovation and the push for this green economy, the unions need to be there because otherwise it's going to be contract work. And so yes, as Ian says, it's a double-edged sword. I was in this industry. And what I made as a geological engineer over there, I've never made it again. I never will make it again. It's just the amount of money, because they're paying you for your life. You have shift work that is 12 hours, 14 hours. If you're on camps, you are 4 weeks off, 6 weeks off, so you don't see your family. So they're paying you for your life. So that kind of money, you're never gonna get again, because it's impossible. So what can we offer the worker so that they switch? And it's the union, it's benefits, it's not moving from their communities. So that's kind of what we're trying to do is, okay, well, if I have electricians, as Ian says, yes, the electricians can find jobs. Electricians, that's why, for instance, on Iron Earth, a big push, yes, solar and wind, but retrofit, so that they stay in the community and they do that work. Boilermakers are gonna be the best job ever coming forward because of all the changes, the need for AC, the need for green-related PEMs. But the other question is, how about we ask workers if they, obviously not the ones that are close to, retirement. We want to make sure that they keep their benefits and they're able to retire. Why we can ask workers other types of jobs. And then the other bit of part, and again, it's just, there's a lot of people that do not have access to this worker force. The women, racialized, marginalized, diverse genders, those people cannot even get into this workforce because of the culture, because of disability-related work. As Ian says, there is an opportunity for a lot of jobs coming forward, but we need to make sure that people that are migrant, that don't have the right accreditation, are experiencing housing insecurity right now, do have access to those jobs. We have to expand our vision, because what we need is good paying jobs, but we also need access to those good paying jobs. And that sometimes that just does not show in the narratives that we see.
My question is, why do I have to come to Parkland Institute to find out just how much the UCP government was subsidizing the oil industry? What's really going on here that between the corporate media and the intellectual elites, that this knowledge is not common knowledge and the public is informed? Information is critical, and it's obvious that the corporate elites don't want the common people to really know what's going on because it's all about profits.
I just wanted to say that the fact that you have to come to Parkland to get this information is on purpose. They're trying to not let you get this information out there. And so that's kind of the work that we're trying to do, is actually counteract on the ground with people, with workers and their communities, and see, hey, we actually see that we're not getting that information. I think one of the biggest things that we heard from Hinton, a lot of Albertans are against the carbon tax. But what Hinton residents were saying, if I understood what the carbon tax was giving me, and because he said, oh, I saw it in a different town, and they built up this, and they did that.
I'm kind of asking about first of all, we've got to stop the concept of expecting corporations to create jobs. They're there to create money for their profit holders. And so just stop the mindset, because why would they create a job and have less of a profit? Not going to happen. So I'm asking you about some of the other accountability factors that may have been included with the government when they gave this tax breakdown, when they dropped it from 12, 10 to 8. Was there any other measurements of accountability towards the oil industry or any industry that received a tax break? Then I want to question your calculations on your tax breaks for the non-profitable years. It's my understanding that is common for any company, not just the oil sector. Or maybe I'm mistaken on that. And I'm not sure if it's a provincial or federal issue either. So when you're presenting the data the way you did today, I would interpret it, if I was a general person, as an attack on the oil industry. When is this something that's in business and corporations in general, to ensure that when we go to speak to present the data to somebody like the other gentleman just asked, the rebuttal back from the oil industry is the way you presented, and I apologize. I know your topic today is about oil, but you present it in that format, the first thing the oil and gas company is going to say, this is just an attack on us, it's insufficient data, where it needs to be presented as this is all corporations get the same thing. So that's why I'm asking you for clarification on the taxing, accountability, and is it federal or provincial?
You're right. Large companies, if they make a loss in any given year, they can use that against taxes they might pay in profitable years. I'm focusing on the oil companies. All of those numbers come from their annual reports. They're there in tables. I'm just pulling them out. They receive more money through the tax system, these 4 companies that are oil companies, in the last 3 years than they paid in. They literally paid negative taxes. They got $4 billion on top of receiving a tax giveaway of, the UCP reducing the rate. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of financial literacy taught in school about personal finances, let alone how corporate taxes work. And to the first gentleman's comment, yeah, I mean, obviously the corporate media, in the case of Post Media, is owned by a venture capitalist firm in the US, and it's a very large company. They are politically aligned ideologically with other large corporations who don't want to pay taxes, yet want to make money and extract our resources, right? Parkland is one place where you can find out that information. We try to disseminate it the best we can. We do that based on, donations from individuals, and that's what it is. So happy to talk about that afterwards too, or anything else.
Great, thank you both. A little gift from Parkland Institute.